Picture this. The quay at Antwerp, late 1880s, a steamer moored alongside, its black hull looming over the crowd. From somewhere above, the chimes of the cathedral drift down. A tinkling, slightly melancholy music, soon drowned out by the strains of the Babat song, Belgium's national anthem. The air smells of coal smoke, salt water, and sweat. On the quay, on the steamer's deck, a jostling, noisy, slightly chaotic crowd. There are soldiers in their neat, impractical uniforms, women in fluttering dresses, ship's officers pacing briskly, shouting orders, hatches being battened down, steam beginning to hiss in the funnels, and groups of relatives and drinking companions lingering for last-minute farewells. And among the passengers, men bound for the Congo. The kind of men whose fitness for residing and governing in tropical Africa would raise doubts even in the greenest novice. Most are young, pale, and underfed looking, undersized, pallid wastrels. But here and there is another type, older, harder, bronze-skinned, the veterans, men who have been through all this before. And their faces, well, their faces are not good to look upon. Scarred, brutal, eyes that are cruel and lustful, the sort of faces you turn away from involuntarily with a shudder. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. Welcome to the last and, I have to say, exciting episode on the Congo. It's been a journey, and I just wanted to thank all of you for kind of sticking with the 3 episodes, because I really feel this is a story that has to be told and definitely shouldn't be forgotten. The scene that I just described was actually written by a barrel-chested, handlebar-moustached young man named Edmund Dene Morel. And I hope you appreciate how I slipped in barrel-chested and handlebar-moustached, because I think it gives a better understanding of what this young man looked like. In truth, I should have probably done the voice as well. Something halfway between, I don't know, a Northern English accent and a French flourish, I suppose. Because Morel, as it happens, was actually born in Paris. His father was French, but his mother was a Northern English Quaker. So why am I actually talking about him in the first place? Because really, this is his story. And in many ways, the story of how King Leopold's personal empire in the Congo began to unravel. Morel is the man who blows the whistle, the man who drags Leopold's crimes into the limelight, the man who, without exaggeration, I have to say, becomes the most effective human rights campaigner, I think, of the 20th century. He builds the first template for every major human rights campaign that follows. There's absolutely a straight line from the abolitionists of the 18th and 19th century to Morel's campaign against forced labor in the Congo, to the anti-apartheid movement and beyond. And this episode, this third, I know it feels like 15, but this third and final in our Congo series is how he does it. Last week, we looked at Leopold's reign of terror in pursuit of ivory and then rubber and, of course, cold, hard cash. And this week, we're going to watch him lose his grip. The Congo doesn't become free or independent, not yet. It simply passes from Leopold's personal control to the Belgian state. But for Leopold, who has spent absolute decades scheming, seizing, and covering his tracks, it is the loss of his greatest prize. Morel's journey starts modestly enough. Born in Paris in 1873, French father, as I mentioned, Quaker mother. His father dies young, and Morel ends up in a boarding school in England, eventually taking British citizenship. He's an obscure young man when, at 18, he actually takes a job with Elder Dempster, a Liverpool shipping company with a monopoly on the Congo trade. This monopoly depends entirely on staying in King Leopold's good books, and it makes Elder Dempster a great deal of money. By the late 1890s, Morel, now in his mid-20s, is often sent to Antwerp to supervise ships. He's ideal for the role. He speaks French, he's conscientious, and he's on the spot to watch the arrivals and departures of every steamer that's bound for the Congo. And it's here at Antwerp docks that Morel actually notices something very odd. Now, it's worth saying, Morel isn't coming to this story as a cynic. Far from it. He's already interested in Africa, and why wouldn't he be? In the 1890s, Africa is the great exotic frontier. It's a place of danger and romance and mystery, at least as far as the European newspapers are concerned. But Morel actually believes it all. The Congo Free State, in his mind, is a shining example of civilization at work. He swallows the propaganda whole, the noble mission, the grand humanitarian project. He even writes articles about it for industry magazines. Africa has a great future, he says. King Leopold is doing fine work, he says. And why not? This is the business he's in. It's the trade that pays his salary. And of course, he wants to read up about it, to talk it up. So there he is on the Antwerp quayside, month after month, watching ships come in from the Congo, and he begins to notice something a little bit odd. The ships arrive heavy, very heavy, groaning literally under the weight of ivory tusks and bales of rubber. But when they leave, nothing, well, almost nothing, goes back the other way. There's no goods, there's no textiles, there's very little food, there's no machinery, nothing that you'd expect in a balanced trade. So Morel starts to ask himself, what exactly are we giving them in return? One day he's summoned by the Secretary of State for the Congo Free State. A man, Morel writes, is thin to emancipation, inhuman, bloodless, petrified. It's almost a description straight out of a Bram Stoker book. A character who should be lurking in a shadowy castle rather than in an office in Antwerp. This cadaverous official is furious. He tells Morel that newspapers have been reporting on a recent shipment back to the Congo, a shipment that actually included a huge consignment of guns. This sort of thing, the man says, must never appear in the press again. Morel is baffled. Why so many guns? And why the secrecy? Why is it such a scandal if the press knows? The man assumes Morel will understand the answer. That, like everyone else in the loop, he will also know when to keep quiet. But Morel is not everyone else, and he's curious. And curiosity at this particular stage is dangerous. He starts looking more closely at the figures of the company ledgers. He compares the accounts to what he sees on the quayside, and they don't match. They're not even close. The profits recorded are far smaller than the value of the ivory and the rubber being unloaded. Somebody is skimming off the top. And given who controls the Congo, there's no great mystery about who that is. But something else jumps out at him. The shipment of guns was not an anomaly. It was standard practice. Thousands upon thousands of rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition are being shipped to the Congo, and almost nothing else. And then one day, the penny drops. Morel later wrote, "It must be bad enough to stumble upon a murder. I have stumbled upon a secret society of murderers with a king for a ringleader." This is a moment straight out of a Robert Harris novel. Shadowy conspiracies, dangerous knowledge, a lone man who effectively knows too much. And like any good thriller, this is the point where the real danger begins. So, Morel does what whistleblowers do. He takes his concerns straight to the top. The head of Elder Dempster is Sir Alfred Jones, a shipping magnate with a direct line to Brussels, and more importantly, to Leopold himself. Morel lays it all out. The discrepancy in the books, the endless shipments of weapons, the one-way traffic of ivory and rubber. He's horrified, he says. He's deeply concerned. Jones nods and gives a sympathetic, leave it with me. I'll go to Brussels myself and I'll speak to the king. Weeks later, Jones summons Morel back. He says, "I've seen the king. Leopold is very disturbed by what you've discovered. A commission will be set up and reforms will be carried out. The Belgians are doing great things in Africa, and we must give them time to get their house in order." I mean, if you've listened to the last two podcasts, you know exactly what's going on there. So this guy, Jones, telling Morel this, it sounds reassuring, but I have to say, it also sounds very hollow, because over the next few months, Morel notices a change. He's sent to Antwerp less often. The dockside trips that gave him such a clear view of the trade are suddenly not part of his daily duties. Then, of course, he's offered a promotion, an overseas posting, great pay, new title, but he refuses. Another offer follows, this time a cushy consultant's role. No travel, no awkward questions, but yet again, he says no. It's obvious now that the company isn't trying to reward him. What they're trying to do is sideline him or buy him off, or both. So in 1901, at the age of just 28, Morel resigns. He walks away from the secure job with a steady income to become a full-time writer, but not just any writer. As he later put it, his goal was to do my best to expose and destroy what I then knew to be the legalized infamy accompanied by unimaginable barbarity, responsible for a vast destruction of human life. In other words, he quits to become a full-time activist. And here's the question. Why? What is it in him that drives him to do this? Because, most people confronted with the truth would do the exact opposite. They would have taken the promotion, they would have kept their head down, and they would have just cashed the checks. Some suggest it was his mother's influence. Remember, she's an English Quaker. And what we've seen throughout history is how often Quakers are actually at the forefront of human rights campaigns, from the abolition of slavery onwards. Morel himself, however, wasn't religious. He didn't attend Quaker meetings or go to any of their church meetings. But I think maybe the values still seeped in. He absorbed them, the moral clarity, the instinct to act when he saw injustice. So it's a reasonable guess, but of course I don't have any hard evidence for it. There's no letters, there's no memoirs saying, my mother taught me this. The truth is, we'll never know. But maybe those values came from home. Maybe they were self-forged. What we do know is that Morel felt personally responsible. He had worked for the very company that was profiting from the bloodshed. That sense of complicity, of having in some way been part of it, I think was a huge part of what drove him. And as we'll see a little bit later, his greatest ally in the story also carried that same burden. And I think at this stage, folks, it wasn't actually uncommon. My mind then was actually taken to Benjamin Lay, the 18th century abolitionist who had actually seen slavery in the Caribbean firsthand and then spent the rest of his life denouncing it. Some of the most passionate campaigners are the ones who at some point were inside the very system that they actually came to then oppose. At first, though, Morel's campaign didn't take off because of public donations and moral outrage. It took off because of business rivalry. His first real backer was another Liverpool shipping magnate, a guy called John Holt, the great rival, really, of Sir Alfred Jones. Holt wanted Elder Dempster weakened, and he saw in Morel almost the perfect weapon. So he gave him the money to start his own paper, which Morel called the West African Mail. And from there, Morel unleashed a flood. Not dozens of articles, not hundreds, millions of words over the course of his campaign. Books, pamphlets, editorials, relentless columns. Much of what we know about the Congo's atrocities today, the absolute statistics, the quotes, the shocking details, we can actually trace all of that back to him. And here's the remarkable thing. Morel never set foot in the Congo. He didn't need to. He persuaded insiders, even officers in Leopold's dreaded Force Publique, to leak to him. Men who, for whatever reason, felt guilt or doubt about what they had done or what they were doing. From 1901 onwards, they were feeding him documents, figures, eyewitness accounts. For those men, Morel became an outlet, someone who could take back what they knew and actually make it matter. And in the end, he received so much that he began to mock the Congo administration in print. In one issue, he published a bullet point list of items their own employees had actually offered to sell him just to rub it in. And of course, the administration panicked. Orders went out. Stop writing things down. Morel is reprinting our documents in the newspapers. And of course, that was just the beginning. When the orders went out to the Congo officials, stop writing things down, Morel somehow got hold of those notes as well. And yes, he printed it in the West African Mail. He was mocking them in their own words, turning their attempts at secrecy into public humiliation. But his single most important source wasn't an insider in the administration at all. It was actually the missionaries, Protestant missionaries, often British and American and or Scandinavian, that were sending him news. These were the ones sending him some of the most harrowing accounts about the floggings and the beatings and the killings. Details so raw that you couldn't forget them if you tried. Last week I talked about the practice of hand chopping, and I said to you then that it was usually carried out on the corpses, to prove that a bullet had been used for a purpose. But there was one story Morel published from an American missionary that was worse. He described watching soldiers cut the hands from living people. The quote was, "Well, the poor heart beat strongly enough to shoot the blood from the cut arteries at a distance of fully 4 feet." Once you read something like that, it stays with you. And it stayed with his readers. By 1903, just 2 years after walking out of Elder Dempster, Morel had done the absolute impossible. Through relentless writing, relentless publishing, and relentless networking with journalists, he had turned the Congo into a political issue in Britain. That very May, the House of Commons held its first debate on the Congo Free State. The motion, introduced by Liberal MP Herbert Samuel, called on the signatories of the Berlin Conference to take action to ensure that the Congolese were treated with humility. And Samuel didn't mince his words either. He spoke of seething turmoil and barbarous acts of repression under Leopold's rule. But here's the part that made the galleries sit forward. He framed it as a patriotic British duty. It has always been the boast of this country, Samuel told the Commons, not only that our own native subjects are governed on principles of justice, but that, ever since the days of Wilberforce, England has been the leader in all movements on behalf of the backward races of the earth. Here is an occasion where those responsible for our policy might pursue these great traditions and add to the annals of the good deeds of this country. Now, of course, there's a lot going on there that I don't really want to get into. But British moral leadership, yes, but also keep in mind British naval supremacy, British imperial self-image. It was the same strain of liberal imperialism that had run through the abolitionist movement. Britain as the empire that used its power to do good. The idea had been woven into foreign policy literally since the Napoleonic Wars, when public pressure effectively forced the Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, to go to the Congress of Vienna and insist the anti-slavery clauses be written in. And of course, here it was again. The motion carried. The Commons resolved that the powers who had signed the Berlin Act should meet again to address what was happening in the Congo. For Morel, this was an absolute breakthrough. Westminster had spoken, and now the question was whether the rest of Europe would listen. The motion in the Commons, folks, is absolutely clear. Britain will press for a Congo state governed with humility. And here's the supreme irony. It's Britain's own imperial position that gives it the authority to take this stance. And look, I know there's listeners now that are going to saying that's rank hypocrisy, and others might call it the ambiguity of empire. The strange fact that an imperial power could, in some instances, use its reach to challenge others' abuses. For now, the Foreign Office hears the debate and decides not to rush in. If Britain is going to act, it actually wants its own evidence, not just the word of an activist like Morel. Fortunately, they have a man on the ground in the Congo, and that man is Roger Casement. Casement, I think, is the other great hero of the Congo story, and I happen to think that his life is one of the most fascinating of the 20th century. And I've actually heard other historians describe him as the greatest Irishman that ever lived. High praise indeed. Born into a Protestant family in Dublin, Casement first came to the Congo at age 19. He'd worked for Henry Morton Stanley as a surveyor and helped chart the route for Leopold's railway. He was tall, he was striking, He had a great black beard and I think also a quiet dignity, and he was known for his courtesy, his rich voice, and his utter seriousness. This was not a man for irony, but the kind of moral earnestness that you would actually want in an activist. From the start, he treated Africans with respect. Too much respect, some colleagues thought. He gave away his supplies freely. He shared his food. He listened to his porters. Joseph Conrad actually met him in 1890 and they traveled together on a steamer. Conrad found him most intelligent and very sympathetic. And some believe that the darker turns in Heart of Darkness owe much to what Casement told him about the Congo. Casement later joined the British colonial service, serving in other parts of Africa, before returning to the Congo in 1901 as Britain's consul. Before heading out, he actually visited King Leopold in Brussels. The king, all smiles, told him, "If you have any problems, come to me first. I am the father of the Congolese." Casement arrived and he was appalled. Beastly, he called it. He began pressing the Foreign Office for permission to travel to the interior and see conditions firsthand. At first, nothing came of it, but after the Commons debate in 1903, the green light came through. Go, investigate, and find the truth. So Casement set off, and I have to say from the start, he was never a very well man. Years in the tropics had actually left him with malaria and dysentery. And privately, he wrestled with doubts and guilt. Casement was also gay. And in the Edwardian world of the earlier 20th century, his sexuality was something that brought him deep personal conflict. And all of this traveled with him into the Congo interior, along with the task of uncovering one of the greatest crimes of his age. Casement, by this point, is in a state of near collapse, certainly by the time he arrives. Nevertheless, he boards a steamer and heads upriver into the interior for what will be the 3 most brutalist months of his entire life. He travels with 2 companions, his faithful bulldog, Joanne, and his servant, Harry Bob, who's a man who can apparently cook only 3 dishes. Chicken and custard are 2 of them, and chicken custard is the 3rd. From all accounts, I've heard that chicken custard is actually delicious. And I imagine if you have dysentery, it's exactly what you want to be eating. Though I have to say, after going through some of Casement's diary entries, they're heavy going and there's a lot of exhaustion and a lot of misery. But what he finds inland is worse than anything that he had feared. His diary entries tell the story in plain, very devastating terms. He calls the country a desert, noting there's no natives left. In one village, he counts just 93 survivors, where there had once been thousands. On August the 30th, he writes of finding 16 men, women, and children tied up in a village very close to the town. Famously, he manages to intervene, and although the men and the women actually get sent to the prison, he manages to persuade their captors to let the children go. From the field, he sends dispatches to London, writing that Leopold has put the natives on a path to their final extinction and the universal condemnation of civilized mankind. And I can only imagine the Foreign Office reading these and wincing. They wanted the truth, yes, but I don't think they wanted the scandal that was about to spill beyond Leopold's Congo and start people asking very awkward questions about the other colonies. Because Casement's journey is already taking him somewhere dangerous, towards condemning not just Leopold's Congo, but the entirety of every imperial project in Africa. So he returns to London in late 1903 and begins writing his official report, polishing the final draft, while actually returning from a country house weekend with his old friend Joseph Conrad. It's a masterpiece of its kind. It's formal, it's measured, and it's packed with legal references and statistics. And the language that he uses is deliberately cool, the tone designed to appeal to the bureaucrats and the diplomats who are about to read it. But of course, at the back are the witness statements, and these are absolutely devastating. They contain the real human voices, the direct accounts of floggings, killings, mutilations. The British ambassador to Belgium is stunned. "I can't believe the Belgians would have done this," he says. "They are cultivated people. even if they are under a tropical sky. In early 1904, the British government sends copies of Casement's report to every signatory of the Berlin Conference. Even Leopold cannot ignore it, and his response is a standard one. He announces his own commission of inquiry. He knows nothing about this. But of course, Casement isn't finished. If anything, the experience has given him the zeal of a convert, and he reaches out to Morel. They meet for dinner in London, and they talk until 2 in the morning. Morel later recalled, "From the moment our hands gripped and our eyes met, mutual trust and confidence were bred, and the feeling of isolation slipped from me like a mantle. Here was a man indeed, one who would convince those in high places of the foulness of the crime committed on a hopeless race." Morel would later write that he could still see Casement in his mind's eye, exactly as he appeared that night, the beginning of a partnership that would change the course of the Congo's history. And I think it's fair to say that neither men forgot that first meeting. Morel would later say that Casement sat crouched over a fire in an otherwise darkened room, speaking in his rich musical voice, soft, almost even, but with a dignity and a pathos that made every word land. He unfolded the story of a vile conspiracy with the ease of a master storyteller. As Casement spoke, Morel later said, "I could actually see those hunted women clutching their children, flying, panic-stricken to the bush, the blood flowing, the ghastly tally of severed heads. It was as if Casement had transported him there with him. Every detail came alive, every horror was immediate." And interestingly, his voice was famous. Everyone who met Casement commented on it. It was actually part of his armory, part of the reason people listened, and part of the reason I think they believed. That night, and in conversations afterwards, Casement said to Morel, "We should set up something big, something entirely devoted to the Congo. The Congo," he told him, "is different from other campaigns. It's a unique evil. If we can rouse the British people, the world might just be roused." Britain had played that part before, keep in mind, in the campaign against slavery. The question was, could they raise that throbbing heart of hers again? For Casement, the Congo, I think, was a singular atrocity. For Morel, too. At least at this stage, it was sui generis. So grotesque, it stood apart from the broader imperial picture. Later, Casement's thinking would shift, and he would actually come to see the Congo as part of a larger pattern. I suppose a symptom of empire itself. And of course, he wasn't wrong. But that divergence, whether the Congo was unique or simply the most extreme example of imperialism's crimes, it remained a live and bitter debate then, and I think even with historians today. But in 1904, the immediate question was practical. Morel said, "I don't have the money to set this up." Casement, without hesitation, handed him a check for £100, more than a month's salary for him and money he could ill afford, but thought was worth it. Morel actually used it to buy a typewriter, and from that typewriter came the Congo Reform Association. It was just after that Casement actually began to fade from the center of this story. The Foreign Office actually promoted him to consul in Lisbon. He found Portugal too civilized for his taste. He thought it was boring. But he and Morel remained close, exchanging letters in code and using nicknames. Casement was always called Tiger, Morel was Bulldog, and Leopold, inevitably, was the king of the beasts. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Kind of wondered with Morel, with Casement's check and his own typewriter, Morel throws himself into his work. The first meeting of the Congo Reform Association is held in Liverpool in 1904. naturally in one of the empire's great shipping ports. And of course, 1,000 people turn up. This campaign is very different from many other human rights movements of its day. I have to say, it's deeply, almost ostensibly establishment. Morel secures endorsements from earls and viscounts and also from MPs and prominent leaders. He actually never attacks the British Empire as a concept, far from it. Morel genuinely believes that Britain is the top nation, and not just for power, but for kindness. Uniquely equipped, I think, to lead a moral crusade. And I think what's interesting is, for a man who started as a shipping clerk, he is a revelation as a campaign organizer. He works with almost manic intensity, writing some 600 letters a month. Imagine that, guys, 600 handwritten letters a month. I can't even write one these days. My hand cramps up. What does that work out to be a day? 600 letters a month? That's about 20 letters a day. And he's addressing audiences literally of thousands with a scrap of notes. He tailors each speech to his listeners, to businessmen. He frames Leopold's monopoly as an assault on free trade. To bishops, he's a Christian duty. To ordinary citizens, Britain's historic responsibility as a top nation is to lead the world. He makes sure his platforms are always crowded with MPs from the different parties. Plus, he always invites the local bigwigs, the business people, the tycoons. He woos wealthy supporters. And of course, among these wealthy supporters, which is the link, the Cadbury family, the chocolate family, the Cadbury family who are also Quakers, and donations pour in. He draws celebrities into the fold, most famously Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And of course, Conan Doyle is a patriotic imperialist, a supporter of Britain's war in South Africa, which had just ended 3 years before. And of course, this makes him a perfect recruit. No one could accuse him of being a bleeding heart anti-imperialist, yet he writes The Crime of the Congo and speaks at Morel's rallies with all the righteous fire of a crusader. And Morel understands the power of images. He pioneers the use of sideshows, stark, unforgettable photographs of Congolese men, women and children with their hands hacked off. And of course, are the moments that audiences come for, the images that they carry away. Historian A.J.P. Taylor himself, from a dissenting background, would later call Morel the most effective activist and campaign leader in British history. And look, he may be right. Morel's campaigns move with the grain of public opinion, tapping into the deep patriotic belief that Britain had abolished the slave trade and stood in some sense on the side of angels. But in Whitehall, there's a very different mood. It's cooler, it's more calculating. A Belgian newspaper editor, quoted by Morel's biographer, Hugh Spence, observed that Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, for much of this period, and I'll quote this directly, is not a man to care much about the fate of the blacks any more than that of the Armenians or the Bulgarians. End quote. Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, was, as Morel saw it, a man who would act only when kicked. And if the kicking stopped, so would he. I think he was among the best kickers in the business. By the mid-1900s, he was kicking not just in Britain, but across the world. The Congo Reform Association had branches by this stage in France and Germany and Scandinavia and Switzerland, in Australia and New Zealand. Morel had put the Congo Free State on the front pages in almost every country on earth. So, was it enough to trouble Leopold? And the question I had was, how would the king fight back? Because what we've seen through the last two podcasts is that that's exactly what he does. As I was going through this research, I also found a little thing by Mark Twain, and he actually called it King Leopold's Soliloquy. It was written in 1905, and I'll just read it to you. They have told how for 20 years I have ruled the Congo state, seizing and holding it as my personal property. Its millions of people, my slaves, the rubber, the ivory, and all the riches of the land, mine solely, gathered for me by the men, women, and little children at the compulsion of the lash and bullet fire. They have kept nothing back. They are filled even with the details which shame should have kept them silent about, since they were exposures of a king anointed by God himself. One of the things that I like about Twain is that his satire is merciless and very timely, I have to say. By 1905, Leopold had turned 60, and he was richer than he had ever been before, but he was also incredibly unpopular at home, and he spent much of his time on the French Riviera aboard his enormous yacht, while his Belgian subjects fumed that their king possessed this vast colony and this vast wealth, and yet brought very little of it back to Belgium. And of course, then there was his disastrous love life. I spoke about Leopold's wife in the other podcasts, and if you didn't listen to those, he despised her. She actually died in 1902, freeing him to openly pursue his new obsession, a woman by the name of Caroline Delacroix, a young French prostitute. They probably met when he was 65 and she would have been 16. And I think she was either introduced or pimped by her lover, who was a former soldier, who remained in the background as this kind of shadowy presence. It was a very strange relationship. Leopold, on the other hand, actually installed Caroline near his castle at Laeken and lavished millions of francs on her in jewels and clothes and surrounded her with servants who could also keep an eye on her. Most scandalously of all, he took her to Queen Victoria's funeral, which caused an absolute sensation. But she did end up bearing him two sons in 1909 and in 1910. And I think in Belgium, far more than the Congo atrocities actually wrecked his public standing. Yet, in the world's press, the two scandals began to smudge, as they do. When Caroline's second son was born with a defect in his hand, Punch magazine actually published a cartoon showing Leopold cradling the baby surrounded by corpses with severed hands. The caption? Vengeance from on high. This message was brutal, basically saying that God himself had punished him for what he had done to the people of the Congo. And I think for that, because we're dealing with a man obsessed with his image, it was far harder to shrug off than what Morel had written about him in the papers. Leopold, stung by the bad press and the rising tide against him, then does something almost very modern. He launches his own PR campaign. He absolutely floods the newspapers with stories about abuses in the British colonies, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. And the message is very blunt. You think I'm bad? Look in the mirror. Does he have a point? Well, that's for another episode. But let me just say this. Every European empire has its skeletons, and Leopold certainly wasn't wrong about that. He then mobilizes his allies in the shipping companies to sponsor friendly books and articles. He sets up lobby groups with pompous, faintly comical names. The Committee for the Protection of Interests in Africa, the Federation for the Defense of Belgian Interests Abroad. All very respectable sounding, I have to say, but they're all designed to take the eye off the main subject, to muddy the waters. And of course, it's all stuff that we've seen very recently. Throughout history, we saw it play out in South Africa. We saw big tobacco. We saw it with big oil. We've seen subsidized magazines, pushing company lines. Back then, Leopold even launches his own publication called New Africa, The Truth About the Congo Free State. And of course, it's got nothing to do with the truth. And of course, he spends freely on journalists, and we know the scale of it because of the paper trail, especially in Germany, where his chief fixer, one Count von Strach, complained bitterly to Brussels about how slow reimbursement was. The Belgians kept asking him for receipts. Von Strach replied, in effect, "Receipts? I'm handing out cash in brown envelopes. There are no receipts." It all sounds so familiar. But of course, Germany was never going to be an easy win. The Kaiser despised Leopold, calling him Satan and Mammon in one person. And keep in mind, though, this is the same Kaiser who's presiding over genocide in Namibia. The double standards here couldn't have been any thicker. By 1904, the battlefront had shifted to the United States. America was the first country to recognize the Congo Free State, something that Morel was actually very quick to remind them of. The US, argued, has a special responsibility to act. There was also the shared tradition between Britain and America, the abolitionist heritage, the moral campaigns of the 19th century. Missionaries crossed the Atlantic for speaking tours, swapping pulpits between, Boston and Birmingham. I think it was, in every way, a very special relationship built on moral activism. So in 1904, Morel himself sails to America, and there he meets Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. And of course, he recruits Mark Twain, the most famous writer in America at the time, who was probably in his 60s, but he was a man who had also traveled the world and had no illusions about how power worked. Twain, thankfully, throws himself into the cause, writing and speaking and lobbying Congress and lobbying the president. And soon it becomes a full-scale crusade, petitions signed by the thousands, endorsed by governors, endorsed by senators, by university presidents. Leopold, of course, true to form, doesn't take this lying down. He never has. He launches his own counteroffensive in the United States. He offers very lucrative Congo concessions to the Guggenheim family and also to John D. Rockefeller. He donates artifacts to the American Museum of Natural History, and he then pays American academics to defend him in print. The fight for the Congo had gone global, and the stakes for Leopold, for Morel, for the millions in the Congo, I think they'd never been higher. To give you just one example of Leopold's American offensive, he actually pays Frederick Starr of the University of Chicago to write a series for the Chicago Tribune called The Truth About the Congo Free State, which unsurprisingly turns out to be the truth as Leopold sees it. I can't help but think about how history repeats itself. But then, of course, the king makes a catastrophic mistake. It had to happen. This is where the very large man enters the story. Leopold's new chief lobbyist in the United States. This guy tips the scale at over £300. Leopold hires Kowalski at a salary equivalent to about $1 million a year. And his job, he only has one job, is to charm Congress and effectively keep America on his side. But of course, there's just two problems. One, Kowalski is a total fraud. And two, he suffers from narcolepsy. He literally falls asleep unexpectedly anywhere. He's been known to nod off in court, in hotel lobbies, in the middle of the street when he was walking, sometimes just standing up. And of course, you can imagine the diplomatic gravitas that this then lent to Leopold's cause. When the Belgian ambassador in Washington hears who the king has hired, he's appalled. This man is a notorious fraud, he warns. What are we doing? After a year, Brussels decides not to renew Kowalski's contract. And of course, he was the slippery slide that then pushes everything from a bit of a farce to a complete disaster. Because what then happens is Kowalski, while awake, is outraged. And he storms off to see the press baron, William Randolph Hearst, and offers him the entire story. And of course, Hearst immediately says yes. In December 1906, the New York American, one of Hearst's flagship papers, runs with the banner headline, King Leopold's amazing attempt to influence our Congress exposed. Kowalski is spilling the beans and he's telling him everything, including the fact that Leopold has actually been paying a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to quietly kill off anti-Congo resolutions. For a week straight, Hearst's papers lead with this scandal. There's photographs of severed hands, missionaries' testimonies, editorials thundering against the Congo regime. It's a public relations catastrophe. The America that once became the first country to recognize Leopold's control over the Congo now sees him as the archetype of everything it mistrusts. Evil, corrupt European monarch bleeding Africa for profit. The PR war in America is over. And of course, Leopold has lost it. Leopold, desperate now, plays what he thinks is his last card. He sets in motion one of his independent commissions to investigate Casement's damning report. 3 judges are appointed, 1 Italian, 1 Belgian, 1 Swiss. On paper, I have to say, they look suitably impartial. But Leopold is confident they'll actually fall into line. After all, the Italian already works in the Congo as the chief appeal court judge. For who? Leopold. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, plenty. The judges take their job far too seriously for a start. They announce that, they will of course travel to the Congo, into the interior, and investigate the abuses firsthand. So, Conrad-like, they steam upriver. They speak to over 400 witnesses, men flogged with a shaquette, women taken hostage, children who have been mutilated. Back in Brussels, Leopold waits for their return and hears troubling rumors. One of the judges, it said, had been moved to tears during a particular testimony. This is a very bad sign, and there's worse to come. After returning from the interior, the judges brief the Governor-General, a man named Costemans. He emerges silent. He's withdrawn. He refuses to speak to anyone, including his family, for 2 days. 2 weeks later, he slits his throat with a razor. Whether it's guilt, shock, or both, it is the most chilling indication yet of what the judges had heard. The report, it's couched in the careful legalistic language of officialdom. There's no sensationalism. There's no lurid detail. The witness statements are not yet released. In fact, they will remain locked away until the 1980s. But when they're finally opened, they preserve the voices of the Congolese with a stark clarity. This is just one of the reports. He told his sentries to tie us to 2 trees with our feet off the ground. Our arms were stretched over our heads. We hung in this way several days and nights. Whilst we hung there, the sentries and the white men beat us in the private parts, on the neck and on other parts of the body with big hard sticks until we fainted. Another one. When I was very small, the soldiers came to make war in my village because of the rubber. They used a knife to cut off my right hand and took it away. That same day, my father and mother were killed, and their hands were cut off. Yet another. The white man held his head, another stood at his feet and hit him with a cane. When he did not move, the other said, "This man is dead. You have killed him." The white man replied, "I don't give a damn." Little wonder these testimonies were hidden in Belgium. The report, far from exonerating Leopold, is the final nail in his public image. And by now, in his early 70s, he's become this grotesque figure, a hypochondriac, pedaling around Belgium on an enormous tricycle, swaddled in blankets and shrinking into canters of hot water that he believes will eventually restore his health. His own people despise him. The Kowalski scandal in America has wrecked his standing abroad, and now his own hand-picked commission has completely condemned his regime. And he sees the truth at last. The Congo cannot be kept. He has to surrender it. But in surrendering it, he means to be paid for it. If he has to give it up, he will actually sell it to the Belgian state for as much as he can get. And I think while it's important to remember that many Belgians, journalists, politicians, ordinary citizens, were actually outraged by what had been done in their country's name, for Leopold, the game is now reduced to one question. How much will the government pay him to go away? It's always been a question of money. For Belgium's government, the whole Leopold affair is the worst publicity imaginable. A small country now synonymous with severed hands and heads. Britain and America are pressing hard. Do not, they warn, let him sell this to France or Germany. Neither of these powers should get their hands on the Congo's rubber, ivory, or minerals. So the only option is for Belgium to take it on themselves. Leopold, for his part, has absolutely no shame about this abrupt reversal. The very thing he swore he would never do. The negotiations are long and very difficult. His accounts are a tangle of creative bookkeeping, and he wants a king's ransom to part with his personal property. Belgium will pay him 50 million francs, billions in today's money. Happily, Leopold has little time to enjoy it. In December 1909, he dies, probably of cancer. True to form, his death is one last scandal. Just before the end, he secretly marries his teenage mistress, Caroline Delacroix, and leaves her most, if not all, of his fortune, deliberately disinheriting his daughters. A vast legal battle then follows between Caroline, Leopold's daughters, and of course the Belgian government. But in public memory, Caroline herself is actually soon eclipsed. Within 5 years, Belgium is now the gallant, plucky little nation resisting Germany in the First World War. Its new King Albert cast as a hero. The royal family, in effect, gets Great War washed, if you like. Leopold disappears, which is another reason why I think these stories are important and they have to be told. But of course, then I came to, as this kind of concluded, well, what happened to the other players in the story? Well, Henry Morton Stanley escapes the scandal almost entirely. He becomes a Liberal Unionist MP, and he dies in 1904, basically before the uproar reaches its peak. Casement moves on to champion Peruvian Amazon rubber workers. He's knighted in 1911. And then turns to Irish nationalism. 1916, he's actually caught smuggling German guns to Ireland for the Easter Rising and is then hanged for treason. Morel and Conan Doyle plead for his life. Conrad refuses to get involved, calling him a traitor who got what was coming to him. Morel continues his Congo work after the Belgian takeover. In the First World War, he becomes Britain's most prominent pacifist. He's actually then jailed for sending pamphlets to Switzerland, and he later joins the Labour Party. In 1922, he actually defeats Winston Churchill for a seat in Dundee, only to die of a heart attack just 2 years later, aged 51. But his legacy is the modern model of the human rights campaigner, meticulous, relentless, and I think also very much unafraid to shame the powerful. And the Congo? So under Belgian rule, most of the visible horrors, the mass mutilations, the hostage taking, the wholesale village burnings, they start to diminish. But much of the machinery of exploitation remains. The same officials, the same force publique, the same chicotte. Forced labor continues, first for rubber, then for copper, tin, and of course then gold mining. Conditions in the mines are lethal, which then kills thousands. During the Second World War, when Belgium is an Allied power, the colonial government still demands 120 days of forced labor per year from Congolese men to meet the Allies' rubber needs. Some later apologists point to Belgian public health campaigns. But I have to say, the deeper legacy is still very grim. Independence eventually comes to the Congo in 1960, and it leads not to stability, but to CIA-backed coups, to political assassinations, and the long kleptocracy of Mobutu Sese Seko. In many ways, I have to say, the true heir to Leopold's methods. And so I began this arc with Leopold's dream of a personal colony, and of course it ends with the Congo still locked in the patterns of extraction and exploitation that he actually perfected. Next week, folks, I'm actually going to return to the book that actually shadowed this entire series, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and I'm going to tackle the bigger unresolved questions. How many died in the Congo Free State? Was it genocide? And is the Congo story an isolated horror or the clearest expression of European imperialism's darkest truths? But for now, we leave King Leopold where history has finally placed him. Really, not as the civilizing monarch that he imagined he would be, but as one of the most notorious thieves of human life in our modern age. Thanks for listening in, folks. Look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.